So recently I was listening to Yasha Levine, who's a journalist, who was talking on Shadowproof, and he was talking about how we, as a leftist movement, and I'm talking about a real leftist movement, what there is of it, which is very small, he was talking about how we have this illusion in some ways of a movement because it's all on social media. And you know, like he gave an example of when they did the Force the Vote march, there was only about 50 people went to that, and yet there was a whole lot of people supported Force the Vote online. And he was talking about how that needs to change, and it needs to get in the streets because, you know, basically Silicon Valley, as you can see how they censored Donald Trump, took him off many platforms and basically took away his voice. And whether one sees that as a good thing or a bad thing, censorship is never a good thing because eventually it leads to censoring of the real left. And hardly anybody will notice when that happens. Channels and whatever else will just be suffocated. But also, if we, as Noam Chomsky argues, if we really believe in freedom of speech, then we need to defend others' freedom of speech, even if we really dislike it. And in this day and age where our voices, and I'm talking about the left, the real left, not the pretend left online, the blue checks that basically cheer on any sort of demonization of Donald Trump and just ignore all the imperialist wars and all of that kind of thing. I'm talking about the real left. This always comes back to censoring the left and suffocating, and we know that it's already happened. It's been happening for some time, and it's just that the right don't pay any attention to it, and they don't care if the left is censored. But anyway, he's basically saying that the being online gives us this false idea that there's an actual movement, and that we need to start organizing away from online. So in some ways, that's something to think about, and and there's a lot of reasons for people ending up online and not doing things in the street, but that's for another conversation. But I wanted to share with you something that Ajamu Baraka said. Ajamu Baraka was a 2016 candidate with Jill Stein, the presidential candidate, and he was talking about how, and I've felt this myself. I felt this for a while. He's talking about how when he and Jill Stein were given, say, an airing on CNN, or he was given an airing of his and Jill Stein's views on another, I think it was in Jacksonville or something. He said even though there wasn't very many people in real time attending the town hall or whatever that they were given, there was like 26 million or something people had watched that particular debate. And he said a lot of people came up to him during their time in 2016 and said how, we keep hearing that that the economy is coming back, and they were saying, I don't feel it in my life. I don't feel that economy is bouncing back at all in my life. And that is the experience of most of the public. This is a narrative, a neoliberal narrative that they keep putting out there to, it's gaslighting people basically. He actually feels quite optimistic that there are people who voted for Trump. There was 72 million people voted for Trump because they were a lot of them, not all of them were white supremacists. I think there was a lot of people who voted for Trump because they don't know what to do anymore because nothing is changing and it's a failed state in the US. There's that aspect. Then there's the other people who voted for Biden because because of Trump. They didn't vote for Biden because Biden held any sort of hope for them. So he said all those people, there is a whole lot of people now who are incredibly discontented with the state of the nation, the abandonment of the public, and particularly in a pandemic. And they see that other countries have what they don't have, yet they're told the US is the richest country in the world, the US is the greatest country in the world. So he sort of sees that what is happening now, and I don't think this is necessarily, I don't think he's an accelerationist or anything, but he sees that what is happening now is something that he sees as very hopeful, because it's basically things are turning. And I've actually, just from being an outsider, not living in the US, I can see things are actually turning, and that this could actually turn out. It's going to get worse, but at the same time, people have woken up. I think a lot of people have woken up to the lies that they're continually told, and so something good will probably come out of this, because there is such dissatisfaction now. And another point that he was making was about how in the past, even in the 60s, the establishment, and this is the Democratic Party, would basically co-opt movements and throw money at them, and then and then sort of water them down, and then they would sort of dissipate. They'd go from radical to kind of watered down. And the same thing is kind of happening right now with the organization. I'm talking about the organization of Black Lives Matter, which is the Democratic Party and other. It's not a transparent organization, and there is hundreds of millions of dollars being thrown at this Black Lives Matter organization, and then the Black Lives Matter organization is then being dumped on top of these organic movements that have come up, that happened with George Floyd, which were about racial justice, but also it turned into a movement about economic justice. And that is something that completely freaks out the capitalist class, completely freaks out the Democratic Party and the GOP. And the Democratic Party wanted to try and just keep it in a small box about racial justice, and then come across as some enlightened party again, that Joe Biden is some kind of Black Lives Matter president and all that nonsense. So they freaked out, and they used the Black Lives Matter organization with the hundreds of millions of dollars that are being thrown at it by who knows who. Google, I think, was one of the donors. It's a non-transparent organization. So that is something that we need to think about too. So it's actually the Black Lives Matter movement, the Black Lives Matter organization, with all that money, is they're using to try and keep and water down this movement that has happened since George Floyd, the killing of George Floyd, that was actually about economic justice and racial justice and some other issues as well. Something else that he said is very important, and I completely agree with this, is that we cannot separate our own national problems of looking for economic justice and all of that, and being this capitalist nightmare that we're all experiencing, and this neoliberal nightmare that is basically the rebellion of capital. That's what neoliberalism is. It's a rebellion of capital, and it was designed to sort of accelerate, and crush the population, and also to make it so dire that we're not even paying attention to the oligarchy and what they're doing, and that they're a kleptocracy. Basically, they're lining their pockets and the pockets of corporations and continuing on the imperialist wars. So that's another. Neoliberalism has to end, and 40 years of it has been absolutely devastating for communities, for countries. As Lenin said, capitalism is inextricably linked to imperialism, and fascism is capitalism in decay. So we're seeing all of that displayed in front of us, and we have to become internationalists, because this isn't just a national thing. These are artificial boundaries, but this is something that is being experienced all over the world. The devastating effects of this capitalist, colonialist system. It's being spread. It's spread right around the world. It's a cancer, and we need to become internationalists and start to support, particularly those in the crosshairs like Bolivia and Iran and Venezuela and other Latin American countries. We need to support them because they're in the crosshairs of U.S. empire. They want to bring neoliberalism into those socialist-leaning or socialist countries, and this is the imperialist nature of capitalism. And then we have the CIA, which one person said, or even could have been even somebody inside the CIA said, the CIA is in the invisible army of capitalism. So we have to become internationalists, and this is something that Ajamu Baraka was strongly stressing in these segments. So please check them out. There are other things that he said, but I picked out two in particular, and it was from the Left Lens, on the Left Lens with Danny Hafong, and it's the Black Agenda Report. So I'll leave a link to that. And we need to support Black Alliance for Peace. Black Left activist movement has always been anti-imperialist, and that is something that that is something that the left really needs to embrace. I mean, I'm talking about the real left. We cannot be only interested in domestic issues and worrying about only domestic issues like Medicare for all and things like that. It's great that people do that, and for certain, if one doesn't have health care, it is absolutely appalling and it's dire. But we need to chew gum and walk at the same time and be anti-imperialist, because this is an international struggle, and we need to recognize that and start supporting others outside of our artificial national borders. So anyway, I'll share this now by Ajamu Baraka, and there's also Margaret Kimberley and Danny Hafong in the conversation, but I just picked out segments of that. Thanks for watching. Till next time. Bye for now.
How do we keep from feeling defeatist? How do we move forward with optimism?
One thing that's instructive about history is that not only is it instructive, but it can be inspirational in the sense that when we either see or go through experiences where we see the potential power of the people, then that is an experience that it never leaves many of us. There's a reason, Margaret, why I think that when you go to some of these events, anti-war, anti-imperialist events, you see so many of us with gray hair.
Yeah.
And then there's a big gap between us and the few young people who are sprinkled. And the question always becomes, why are so many of these old folks still involved in the struggle? And I tell people, I think that the main reason for that is because we truly understood, because we had a chance to experience it, the power of the people, the optimism of the moment. We absolutely believe that we could defeat this system and build a new society and a new world. And some people fail to decide, no question about that. But for those of us who had that feeling, had those experiences, that is what keeps you going, because you understand what, in fact, can be put in place. So what we have, that's why it's so important for us to reclaim Dr. King and re-situate him in our movement as a product of our movement. We understood that it is through organization, the persistent, systematic building of organized resistance, that can result in winning concessions from a more powerful opposition, like what we did, and can result in creating real power among our folks and a real sense of optimism that we, in fact, can go forward and build a new world. So what drives us is our understanding that the organized people that are conscious, really, it sounds like a cliche, but they really cannot be defeated. That's when we make fundamental changes. And even as we face the conditions we are facing today, in the midst of the most critical, the deepest crisis that the capitalist system has ever really gone through or experienced, including the so-called Great Depression, I feel great optimism, because look at the kinds of young people who are coming into the ranks of the Black Alliance for Peace, for example.
Yeah.
Young people who are looking for answers, but who are already committed to an idea that we, in fact, can organize ourselves and make real radical change. So the history of struggles, not only in this country but globally, that's what keeps the optimism. That's what keeps us from becoming demoralized. We know that, in fact, we, as Dr. King said, that we are, in fact, on the right side of history. One of the things that, as we make this transition to the current moment, that we remind ourselves of, is that we made many mistakes. And one major mistake that we made in our optimism, and some maybe sort of naivete, was we didn't understand the extent to which the system was able to make reforms, to incorporate elements of our movement, to confuse people, to make adjustments. We thought that we had a critique that suggested that the crisis was going to intensify, and that it was going to lead to the kind of radical change we thought was right around the corner. Neoliberalism that started to emerge in the 1970s was basically part of that counter-revolutionary momentum. Neoliberalism, properly understood, has to be seen as the rebellion of capital, the rebellion of capital against the post-war hegemonic economic philosophy and governmental philosophy of Keynesianism. So part of the counter-revolutionary thrust in the 1970s was to reintroduce the classical capitalist economics and to reimpose the rule of capital, to discipline the working classes, to attack and to undermine radical politics. So that move in the 1970s to what we refer to as neoliberalism and globalization, set the stage for today. It set the stage for the rise of Trump, because with over 40 years of neoliberal policies, it created the conditions, the frustrations, the anger, the radical individualism, the bloated state in the service of capital that created the conditions that brought Trump to power. You can't understand Trump unless you understand those conditions, including the collapse of 2007 and 2008, and the inability of the system to rebound in a way that really addressed the material contradictions of neoliberalism. That didn't happen, and as a consequence, Trump rode to power even after he was created as the optimal candidate that the Clinton campaign wanted. But because they didn't understand the conditions that people were facing, and we saw it when I was on the Green Party campaign stump. You know, people who were always telling me in jail, you know, they talk about this economic recovery and the things are better, but where are things better? I don't feel it in my life and in the life of my family. And we were seeing the conditions around the country. And we knew something was up. And that's why we knew something was up, because of so many people who were coming to our campaign. Now, in the end, they didn't end up voting for us, but we had that alternative set of debates that the Democracy Now! Did for us. We had 28 million people who watched those debates. When CNN did the town hall meeting with us, we had 26 million people who watched that. The last few weeks of October, before the election, when normally for a third party candidacy, you feel the dissipation of energy. We weren't seeing that. We were having functions. I had a function in Mississippi and in Jackson State. It was the last minute thing we threw together. We had 100 people in the audience, but it was watched by 365,000 people. Those are the kind of numbers we're pulling. I ended up in Detroit 4 days before the election, on the same day that Tim Kaine, the vice presidential candidate for Hillary Clinton, and guess who was drawing the biggest crowds? So the people understood that something was up. Now, in the end, they went for the Democrats out of issues of pragmatism and all of that. But my point is this: there's something ripe in this country for a alternative politics. Part of that rightness, if you will, is being manifested in the right-wing populism we see grouped around Donald Trump. And there's 75 million people who voted for him. But on the other side, there's something, a potential there too, with the 80 million people who voted against Donald Trump and not necessarily for Joe Biden. But many of those millions of people are looking for something different than the neoliberalism that they're going to get with Joe Biden. And that's where the optimism is, that we can build something that's really alternative, that really would take us further than the limitations of the neoliberal project that we know the Democrats are going to reintroduce in the next few days. The many people who went to the streets last year, they were motivated by the snuff film that we saw of George Floyd, but they were also motivated by a sense of frustration, of anger, a sense that none of our lives really meant much to the authorities. Because around that same time, in the latter part of May, we saw how the capitalists were finding ways to try to drive people back to work, even though people didn't have PPE. They were so concerned about the plight of the economy that they exposed the fact that they really didn't care about the health of the people. And that message was something that people felt. So the murder of George Floyd was almost, in a sense, of sort of a metaphor for the assault that all of them were feeling, and the sense of outrage and the desire to fight back. And I think that's why people fought back so ferociously. I mean, you know, folks burnt down a police station in Minneapolis. I mean, this was a militant response, okay? And I think because of the militancy of it, That is why the authorities, the state, the ruling class had to try to make sure that they could try to control it some kind of way and change its character to prevent it from moving from a outrage against for George Floyd to something similar to what we saw in France when the yellow vest came out. The objectives were relatively limited and ended up being a general rebellion against neoliberal policies. And the way they wanted to try to manage that in the U.S. was when they is by flooding the movement with all this money, placing this organization we refer to as Black Lives Matter, which is really a fictitious organization. The Black Lives Matter exists in various locales, okay? But what they did was take the notion of Black Lives Matter and place them on top of something that they really didn't have a whole lot to do with. These were spontaneous reactions, spontaneous rebellions. Of course, they said Black Lives Matter because that's the only slogan people really had at that moment, okay? But what they wanted to do, the rulers, was to make sure that rebellion stayed at the sort of amorphous level of the demand for something called racial justice or criminal justice reform, and not make that pivot to a general critique and opposition to the system. They disconnected the notion of racial justice from economic justice. We talked about that in the context of a Black Agenda Report. You know, a number of people talked about that, how that disconnection took place. That was conscious, okay? They created the myth of the good protesters versus the bad protesters, okay? You know, they talked about the outside agitators who are white, because one of the things that really freaked them out was the multiracial, multinational character of these political activities. That's the biggest fear that the rulers have in this country, is for that kind of connection to be made and to be expressed in a political movement. So all of these things came together to basically undermine that energy and to keep it directed in channels that could be easily absorbed by the system. And that's what happened. You know, then they floated out. They unleashed this campaign, this defund the police campaign, and it was an element of that takes you from really the streets to negotiations with various local authorities and you engage in this kind of bureaucratic struggle around funding, okay, where the funds go, and the critical element of who controls the police, the role of the police, the state, all that gets sort of pushed to the side. So yes, this is what we have to deal with. And today we see that energy has kind of dissipated because, like you said, Margaret, some kind of way, these localized struggles and this sort of general call for racial justice got colonized by the Democratic Party and got translated into an anti-Trump movement. So people say, Black Lives Matter, please go out and vote. So, you know, I want to make sure that people understand that it's not a critique of the people who are in the streets, many of them who sacrifice, but a critique of how those kinds of motions can be co-opted by the movement. They, in fact, can be used to legitimize the state. Because when you talk about the possibility of justice, that you are suggesting in a way, you're implying in a way, that the settler colonial state has the ability to, in fact, give you justice, that it has the legitimacy to give justice. And that we know is a myth, just like the whole notion of or the confusion around the role of the police. The police are not going to be voluntarily disbanded, because the police are the front line in the protection of the state. And you're not going to get rid of the police until you fundamentally transform the nature of this state. So these are all the kind of things we have to talk about and get clear about as we construct a radical movement here in this country. And the other thing we have to get clear about too is that what we are facing in the US cannot be understood and cannot be defeated in abstraction from the global nature of what we are facing. We're just involved in the national expression of a global system. So when we talk about capitalism, we're not talking about just, you're not talking about U.S. capitalism like there's something separate from European capitalism or capitalism in Brazil. There are some specific national expressions. But we're talking about the hegemony of a global system. And from our point of view, we talk about the colonial capitalist system. We've got to understand that there's no freedom in the U.S. without defeating global capital, okay? And so those are the lessons we have to learn. When we learn that, then we understand why it's so vitally important for us to be in solidarity with the people who are fighting for liberation in various parts of the global system. That you cannot, is a contradiction, a moral and a political contradiction, for people to pretend to be radicals in the U.S. and that's a mumbling word about U.S. criminality in Venezuela, in Iran, in North Korea, in China, around surrounding China. It's a contradiction that we've got to address. You know, so these are some of the things we have to do in terms of making those kind of connections and centering the internationalist worldview, because we are part of a collective humanity. And the capitalist rulers want to keep us divided. They want to keep us in competition with one another. They want to keep us connected to our own pathetic little national states. When the real struggle is for us to liberate ourselves from this global system, to understand that, you know, if we don't deal with climate change, you know, we all are going to die. If we allow these freaks who are openly articulated the possibility of a nuclear first strike, if there's a nuclear exchange, all of us die, okay? So these issues are not some kind of exotic kind of add-on to your real issues. If you're not talking about militarism, like Dr. King and we and us as a peace movement, as an anti-imperialist movement, if you're not making the connection between anti-imperialism and the police forces cracking your heads in Detroit and Chicago and Atlanta, then you're missing the boat. And in fact, you are propping up the very system you claim to be opposed to.